Hello everybody. My name is Dhruv Pai. I'm a rising senior at Montgomery Blair High School in Silver Spring, Maryland. And my talk is about addressing the uncertainty of food availability during the COVID-19 pandemic and really beyond through remote sensing and machine learning. Okay, so a little bit about me. Like I said, I'm a rising senior, so I'm in the class of 2022 at Montgomery Blair. I'm in the Science, Mathematics, and Computer Science Magnet program there. And a little bit of what I do outside of school, I'm a pretty avid volunteer. I've started 2 nonprofit organizations, one of which, Teens Helping Seniors, is also addressing food insecurity and has really grown to an international scale. I'm also civically involved. I participate in local campaigns, and I'm also involved in a project that's working on equity and civics. I sing in my choir. I sing in the state choir as well and the National Philharmonic. I'm also really involved in STEM research. I've been doing research for about 5 or 6 years now. And I've gone to the International Science and Engineering Fair, and I'm a 2021 RSI scholar. And then, yeah, I'm also involved in orating and debating, particularly extemporaneous speech. Okay, so a little bit of introduction about food security. So the USAID defines food security as having at all times physical and economic access to sufficient food. But unfortunately, many people around the world, and even in first world countries like the United States, lack access to food, and that's nearly 1 billion people. In the US, 14.7% of households have low or very low food security, and the World Health Organization, or WHO, classifies food security according to these 3 basic links in a chain that need to all be accomplished in order to have food secure populations. The first is food availability, and that happens on the side of the producer, like the farmer, for example. The second is food access, and this is mostly distribution oriented. So for example, markets and supply chains. And the last one is food utilization, which is on the consumer side. So a bit of background about how we can leverage something called remote sensing to address food insecurity. So first of all, when we talk about access to food and we talk about food production and distribution, something to mention are food markets and commodity markets, right? Because these markets set the price and regulate the flow of these commodity goods to consumers. And so in order for these markets to make decisions, they need knowledge of, crop specific planted areas, conditions, expected yields. And, without this information, you can understand they're kind of in the dark when making these decisions. And the result of this is something called market uncertainty, which is really damaging for stakeholders. It leads to people not getting food on the table. It leads to farmers not being able to sell their crops, and it leads to the entire supply chain essentially falling apart. So how can we combat this? Well, the solution is through something called, remote sensing, which can combine machine learning, ML, with Earth observation data. So Earth observation is just data from satellites that, are observations of Earth. And then machine learning can be used to find important patterns within that Earth observation data and extrapolate trends so that we can generate useful information for markets. And together, this forms a extremely powerful tool for agricultural monitoring that is already being used by markets around the world in order to better understand how their crops are performing. Depending on your familiarity of machine learning, you may know that machine learning models require ground truth data in order to train the models. And ground truth data is quite literally data that has been collected from the ground. It is essentially, if you go out and survey crops on an individual basis, that's ground truth data. And without ground truth data, it's hard to train models, but at the same time, it's also really hard to acquire ground truth data, especially during the COVID pandemic. And so as part of, the beginning phases of my project, I actually performed market analysis to see how crop market uncertainty has been changing over the past 7 growing seasons. And so what I did was I pulled world agricultural supply and demand estimates from the USDA website. And I looked at 2 key commodity crops, which are the largest crops produced in the US, corn and soybean. And on the x-axis, you can see the growing season for these various crops, which generally goes from April to November and is delineated into 3 separate phases. You have planting and green up, you have peak, and you have senescence. And these are all 3 very stereotyped phases. Every crop goes through these same phases. And as you can see, based on the x-axis, as the years increase and, as we get closer to 2020, our current date, the crop market uncertainty, especially in the beginning of the growing season during planting and green up, has only been increasing. And this is probably due to an increase in weather-related disasters, such as the El Derecho hurricane that occurred in Iowa in 2019, that have increased uncertainty, though, COVID will have contributed to this by the time the data for the COVID pandemic becomes available. Okay, so a bit of background for how the remote sensing field is right now. So right now, the goal of the remote sensing field is for crop classification. So essentially that means identifying which crops are being grown, identifying whether a given field is growing corn, soybean, some other crop, and then compiling that information on a large scale to get information useful to markets. And so the main way we do this in the machine learning side is through random forest and decision trees, which are, simplistic models, but have been shown to be effective across a variety of longitudinal studies. And then one of the most interesting studies that I found was, looking at the spatial distribution of forest diseases in Spain using random forest and a generalized additive model. But there are a few problems with the current remote sensing field. The first one is that the remote sensing happens after the season is over, right? So, researchers are performing these analyses 6 months or a year after the crops have already been harvested and have already been gone through the market, right? So obviously this isn't going to be useful for addressing market uncertainty. In order for it to be useful, it has to happen during the growing season. And the second one is that there are a lot of things in the remote sensing field that we might take for granted, such as, where we train our models and what spectral resolutions we use, etc. And so it's kind of a lot of arbitrary parameters that have been set in the field that haven't really been questioned for a long time. And so part of my project was also questioning, those parameters and whether we're really making smart decisions there. Okay, so my methodology. So I acquired data from 2 satellites. There's the Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2/Sentinel-1. And so these are both NASA satellites. And the reason why we needed 2 different data sets is because these 2 different satellites cover different tracts of land at different times during the year. And by harmonizing them, in essence, combining their 2 data sets, we're able to achieve, satellite observations for most of the United States, particularly the Midwestern Corn Belt, on a consistent basis throughout the year. And so part of that means also harmonizing the actual resolutions of the data sets, because the Landsat 8 satellite is 40 meters resolution, and Sentinel-2, Sentinel-1 are 10-meter resolution. So you have to deal with that. And then when it comes to actually having our ground truth data, which, like I said earlier, is vital to training these machine learning models, what I used as sort of a surrogate for ground truth data is the cropland data layer, or CDL, which is released by the USDA. And now you might be asking, why do you use a surrogate for ground truth data? Why don't you use the actual ground truth data itself? Well, unfortunately, that ground truth data becomes available only, at least 2 to 3 years after the season is over. So it's not practical to use it for in-season crop type classification. Even the cropland data layer becomes available a bit less than a year after the season is over. But the cropland data layer is the best alternative we have right now. For the training size for the machine learning models, I'm not going to get too much into the machine learning aspect of it since this is a global health conference. But for those of you who are interested, I use 10 to the 5th pixels per model because this was the size that balanced the computation speed as well as the accuracy. I tested on 2019 and then I predicted on the 2020 growing season. Essentially, I made sure my models were working using 2019 data because we had data for how 2019 markets performed. And then for predictions, I did it on 2020 because that was the actual COVID pandemic. And that's when we needed these predictions for how crops are performing. Okay, so now just a brief visualization of, where I'm running these models and where I'm looking at food insecurity. And so this is in the map on the bottom, you can see the state of Iowa, circled in green. And so when we talk about satellite data, we typically split it up into these different tiles called MGRS tiles, Military Grid Reference System. And so these various tiles are, how we partition our data sets spatially. And so as you can see, I chose 23 MGRS tiles in Iowa. Iowa is the #1 corn producer in the United States. So it served as a good pilot test study for the in-season classification at large. And as you can see, based on the label in red, the ground truth data that we actually have for 2020 is very, very minimal. It's in Illinois mostly. And even then, it doesn't even begin to cover most of the agricultural fields there. So it's apparent that we need more robust models, considering there's a lack of ground truth data to train these models with. So part of pre-processing means selecting relevant bands. When we talk about satellite data, it comes in a lot of different bands, spectral bands. And these bands have different information that can be useful. So the 2 bands that I selected based on testing of which were the most useful bands were least surface water index and normalized difference water index, LSWI and NDWI respectively. And then I performed some standard pre-processing, removing significant cloud cover, missing data, normalizing growth stages, because, different crops can be at different points in their growing cycle, like I was saying earlier about planting versus peak versus senescence. And then finally, I generated homogeneity masks. And the goal of that is just to, smooth over NaN, not a number values, or large errors that can sometimes result because of errors in the actual satellite observations themselves. And then another part of my study was, like I said earlier, testing whether our presumptions about, this is the best way to train our models were actually correct. And so to do that, I investigated, 4 new models that had not been previously investigated in the remote sensing field at different spatial resolutions: a regional, universal, an agroecological, and an ensemble model. And I wanted to see if these could improve the accuracy of crop classification during the pandemic. And I can get more into the specific methodology of these if there are any questions about that. So these are the confusion matrices. It's a little difficult to interpret them when it comes to if you're not familiar with machine learning beforehand. But a brief rundown of them is that, if you look at the diagonal of the matrix, that essentially tells you the accuracy. So in the top left square, if you see a number like 0.7, it means the model was 70% accurate at classifying corn as, corn successfully. And then if you look at the bottom right, the model was 83% accurate, for example, at classifying other, something that's not corn and soybean, as actually other. So basically, by reading along the diagonal, you can assess the accuracy of different models. And so, yeah, certainly if you look here, you're like, oh, maybe a 5% difference in accuracy, 3% difference. That doesn't seem significant. But in reality, when it comes to remote sensing, the goal is to build these confidence intervals. And if you're familiar with statistics, you might know that, the higher accuracy we have for our estimates, the less samples we need for our confidence interval. And so what that manifests to is just a 2 to 3% increase in the accuracy means tens of thousands of less fields that actually have to be surveyed by the USDA. And so these are actually significant results. And then finally, I wanted to test whether, the accuracy of crop classification varies as a result of location. So these are the military grid reference system tiles. And as you can see, the, brightly colored ones, 15 TVF, 15 TVG, they have, greater deviation in terms of model performance. And these are actually also the location of Iowa's major urban centers like Des Moines. And so there might be a link between those. And this is a visualization of, what my study actually looked like. So on the left, you can see the Google Earth Pro images of the 15 TVG MGRS tile, which includes Des Moines and Ames, 2 of Iowa's, biggest cities. And on the right, you can actually see the predictions from the model output. And so the blue is classified as soybean, purple as corn, and yellow as other. So the model was able to successfully classify Des Moines, the corresponding river, Ames, as well as other small cities as other, while at the same time classifying crops as, soybean or corn, respectively. So what are the conclusions of the study? Well, first of all, we demonstrated new remote sensing models that had clear advantages over current approaches to land cover classification. Second, we applied those models directly to the 2020 growing season in order to generate predictions that can be directly applied for growing markets. And the result of this is not only fully robust models for any land cover classification problem, not just necessarily corn and soybean in the United States corn belt, but also having improved predictions, which then have the potential to mitigate food insecurity by, in turn, mitigating market uncertainty and thus having a positive impact on global health. So these are, some of my references, not all of them, but these are a selected few. I'd like to acknowledge my mentor, Dr. Hannah Kerner, Assistant Professor of Geographical Sciences at the University of Maryland, and her team, NASA Harvest, who is doing similar work in Earth data for informed agricultural decisions around the world, especially in continents like Africa and South America. And this is my contact information. If you have any questions or concerns, I strongly encourage you to reach out to me at any of these sites. And thank you so much.